Thank you very much, Sandra, and to the organizers of the conference, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you and to learn so much and to make a contribution to this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, to some extent I'm standing in for Mr. Arnold Chitombu of the SADC Employment and Labour sector, who couldn't be here. And I was asked by the SSC to try and incorporate in one of my presentations to the conference the issue of social protection for migrants. This is a burning issue also for this country. So I've put together these slides, and we won't have time to get through everything. And I might do a little bit of reading just for time purposes. We have run behind schedule, so mindful of that too. But nevertheless, what I would have loved to cover with you is some of the trends, tendencies and complexities in SADC concerning migration, in particular labour migration, and particularly in the social protection challenges, some of the responses that we have seen in SADC at the regional and even at the national, the country level, and then core Africa Union or African Union Commission developments, very, very important recent developments, even at a SADC level. And then to ask ourselves the question, how do we strengthen social protection for migrants, for labour migrants? And then final conclusion recommendations. The fact of the matter is that this is one of the really most weakly developed areas of coverage of people in our region, social protection for migrant workers. In fact, this region in Africa, in my view, lags far, far behind most of the other regions, in particular West and East Africa. I'll come back to that. Traditionally in SADC, as you can see there, has been a strong focus on labour migration. It has always been with us. It has been growing in extent, in context, and the reasons for that is clear. Just look at some of the remittance figures. Lesotho probably topping the region. 28.5% of its GDP comes as a result of remittances paid by their workers who work elsewhere in the UK and South Africa. And then we have also seen a marked increase in irregular migration, human trafficking, smuggling, but that I'm not going to discuss to you for time reasons. So what is the nature of the migration that we see in the region? If I can summarize, several reports are available if you're interested. Intra-SADC migration, in other words, within the region, is the prevailing characteristic. Intra-SADC labour migration is literally deeply entrenched and generations long, often within the same households. For many, migration has become a career. The majority of those who migrate within SADC are men, interesting, not women, with some exception, household heads, older and married, and the primary reason for migration relate to livelihood support and economic improvement. So that's a sort of a snapshot summary. However, there are many, many challenges. The first is, as we know so well from the neighboring country, South Africa, maltreatment, xenophobic attacks, nationality discrimination, yes, in law and in practice. Most of our SADC countries still discriminate against even citizens or nationals from other SADC countries. Some countries even in social security law terms. This country is an exception as far as that issue is concerned. For several reasons, SADC migrant workers may not be covered by any social security system for that matter. And the reasons, you can see some of the reasons up there, complicated reasons which I'm not going into in terms of the legal framework. But I want to stress the second issue there. It's a control and an exclusion mindset. We find it in almost all our SADC countries that we talk about regional integration, yet the systems are all geared towards controlling, keeping people out. We are paying lip service to what we have committed ourselves to in the region. Nationality and residence requirements, contribution periods, work in the informal economy, and the reason for that is by and large our social security systems currently, most of them, almost all of them in all of the countries would exclude people who work in the informal sector from being covered by social security systems. So for that reason, many of the migrants are informal workers, so they're excluded for that reason, and that needs to be addressed. And then documentation and other administrative barriers, huge problems. South Africa probably topping the scale as far as that is concerned. If there's time, I can give you some practical examples as to some of these problems in South African context. South Africa really serves as a magnet for people to come and work. So national labour, social security, migration and related policies and legal frameworks do not capture the social protection plight of migrant workers and their families sufficiently. What about bilateral agreements? They are conspicuous by their absence. They make limited provision for employment protection while largely ignoring social security protection of migrant workers. This is, of course, the sad part of the story. Social security portability arrangements, in other words, where you can, for example, if you have contributed to a pension scheme in the formal sense of the word, you can take your contributions and your benefit entitlements with you to the other country where you move to. Again, we see almost nothing of that, with a few exceptions in the whole of the SADC region. Despite important exceptions, the extension of social security protection by countries of origin to their own migrant workers who migrate to other countries in the region, this still has to develop. And in multilateral arrangements at the level of SADC even, despite the worldwide eminence of such arrangements, are sorely lacking in SADC. But however, there is some good news. Let's look at the instrumental perspective. From the instrumental perspective, the recently adopted SADC Protocol on Employment and Labor explicitly provides for many of these issues, actually taking its cue from the Code on Social Security in SADC of 2007. But this protocol is prominent in Article 19 in particular. It provides for employment and social protection, for portability, for equal treatment, etc. So this is something to look out for, and hopefully this country, as is the case with the other countries, will soon ratify this very protocol. An older protocol that caused a lot of commotion, the SADC Protocol on the Facilitation of Movement of Persons, is a weak instrument. It does not really provide for free movement, and it remains insufficiently ratified, so it's not even yet in force. But there are other very important recent developments at the instrumental level, and our hope is that these new instruments, together with the protocol I mentioned, the 2014 protocol, will help to steer countries towards a more open approach towards labor migration. Because the SADC countries together adopted a labor migration action plan in 2014, and on the basis of that, a labor migration policy framework, and yet a proper policy which would provide for free movement and for cross-border portability, that still has to develop. How does it all come about? Instrumental to driving these developments are particular participatory and consultative processes involving the technical support of both the ILO and the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, with specific reference to the SADC labor and employment sector. That's the SADC structural entity, and in a MITSA process spearheaded by the IOM. Important and very interesting new development is also developments concerning the facilitation of movement of business people and professionals in 5 SADC countries on the basis of a new framework that has developed, the so-called APEI, Accelerated Program for Economic Integration, and yet we're waiting for the social security implications of this to develop. Note has to be taken of important instruments, standards, guidelines, and processes aimed at supporting intra-African labor migration in particular. I'm now looking at the continental level, and just look at what we have there. We have a very important 2006 instrument called the AU Migration Policy Framework. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, this AU Migration Policy Framework served as a basis for the IGAD region and the Horn of Africa in 2012 to develop its own regional migration policy framework. So, and it also led to something which is the last issue here. But the second last point is also important. In 2004, there was an Ouagadougou Declaration of Employment and Poverty Eradication, which was then renewed in 2014, adopted formally in January this year. For the next 10 years, for the first time, one of the 6 key priority areas for the African Union Commission as far as poverty eradication is concerned is indeed the area of labor migration and regional integration, and these two go together. And then all important, if we had more time, I would have talked about this. It's a very important, comprehensive, multi-sectoral, multi-partner joint labor migration program, recently adopted by the AU, formally adopted also by the heads of summit. And it is an AUC flagship program together with all the RECs, all the regional economic communities, almost all of them, including SADC, ILO, the IOM, and UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa. Initially for a 4-year, but actually a 10-year period. really covering the whole area almost of labour migration, all the issues that are relevant, from portability of social security benefits, the welfare rights of migrants, and a host of other issues. And soon this will be rolled out in practice. Very briefly, currently bilateral labour agreements, social security agreements on a bilateral basis, as I've said, do not really provide for what we need. Also migrant workers, as I said earlier, are often not covered by the social security system, either the home or the host country. And then we talk about multilateral agreements. But what are the examples? And let me just concentrate on Africa. And outside Africa, there are numerous examples, but we can learn lessons from our own continent. In West Africa, probably the most advanced system, the ECOWAS system, the General Convention on Social Security of 2012, providing for freedom of movement, equality of treatment, and in particular, in portability of benefits. We'll actually be amazed to know there was, at least in the past, one very successful multilateral arrangement, and that is the so-called Great Lakes Area Agreement, which ran for 7-8 years and then came to halt as a result of civil war in some of the countries. And in the East African community, the Common Market Protocol gives concrete effect to the EAC treaty provisions and links for purpose of entitlement to social security benefits, the free movement principle to equal treatment as well. But portability still needs to be developed. Right. So the last issue here, interestingly, all over the world we see a movement by countries that send out workers, like the Philippines, who at any given time is 10 million overseas migrant workers. Most of them work in the Gulf states, are not properly covered by the Gulf state social security schemes. So what the Philippines has done, as one of many countries, is to extend its social security system to these very migrant workers of their own in a particular way, which we don't need to discuss in detail. Interesting, in our own region, Mozambique is a country that has partially done this as well. So what are our conclusions, recommendations? There's a need to address the underlying drivers of migration. Secondly, importantly, the large-scale exclusion of significant categories of migrant workers from social protection similarly requires comprehensive and holistic approaches. These responses should be mindful of and give expression to the considerable measure of labor migration in the region and the imperative of regional migration. There's much that we can learn from international, continental, and sub-regional instruments and frameworks in the areas mentioned there: prohibition of discrimination, portability of benefits, ethical recruitment of migrant workers. Yet, ratification is limited and implementation is weak. AU and SADC instruments are important building blocks towards a streamlined regulation of labor migration and the movement of business skills and professionals. Intra-SADC migration is a daily reality. It is likely to increase given widespread unemployment, and in an attempt to ensure individual and household survival, proper arrangements providing for employment and social protection of migrant workers to be embedded in suitable government-to-government labor and social security agreements are needed. And finally, this requires careful consideration of current bilateral agreements and of new agreements to be concluded, supported by appropriate SADC multilateral agreements. In this way, we can give effect to regional integration, and in the absence of meaningful social protection offered by the systems of the host country, at this stage at least, and by bilateral multilateral agreements, the absence of that, those SADC countries should consider extending social security coverage unilaterally to their own migrant workers abroad in accordance with international precedent. Sorry for the rush. I think you'll understand. Thank you.